In this video, we'll go over some of the ways that Python is integrated into Houdini. Unlike some other 3D packages, in Houdini, SideFX has shipped some very powerful Python editing tools directly with the package. So you don't necessarily have to set up your own external editor, although you might want to later. So the first thing that we'll talk about is how to open a simple Python shell. So the easiest way to open a Python shell in Houdini is just to go to Windows up here, and then there's a Python shell here. And that opens a new window that is a Python shell. This is a complete Python shell, it's not just dedicated to Houdini. So I could type something like print Houdini is cool, and it's completely normal. Note that if I close this down with Control D, from any part of Houdini, if I need to get it back, I can simply hold Alt Shift and press P, and it'll come back up. Notice that this is the same Python shell that I had up before. So I'm not actually closing it, even if I close the window and bring it back up. Everything is still here. This is really nice because you can just hit the up arrow and get your old commands back if you need to, and they never go away while Houdini is open. Notice that all of this stuff does go away when you close Houdini though, so be careful about that. So having to bring up the Python shell every time you want to use Python and having it obscure other parts of your interface and what you're working on can be very annoying. So SideFX has given us a way to permanently add a Python shell to your interface. The way that you do this is you go up to this little corner here, and notice that all of these panes have this little drop down arrow. I like to add it to this part since the viewport is the biggest part of the interface, but really you can add it wherever you want. So if you click this little arrow, you can see there's this split pane left right or split pane left top bottom, which does pretty much exactly what it sounds like. If you click it, it just adds another pane. Now notice that this is a scene view. We want a Python shell. So if you right click here on the tab where it says scene view, you can just change it to Python shell. And there's our Python shell. If I just hit enter a few times, you can see it. Now one thing to notice is that if you add multiple Python shells, they're actually all different shells. So if I type print blorg here, I get blorg. And then if I go over here and I split pane left right, I make it another Python shell. I can't hit the up arrow to get print blorg. If I do print fawn here, if I go back to this Python shell, I can't hit the up arrow to get to print fawn. So something to keep in mind is that each of these Python shells is completely separate, and these are also separate from the version of the Python shell that you get if you hit Alt-Shift-P. These are all different shells. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and close this one real fast because it's crowding my network editor. Now you might think that having this Python shell here is really annoying because it makes the viewport smaller, and it is sometimes annoying. So one way that you can deal with that is you can just click this little down arrow here, and that'll hide it. And then you can click this up arrow here to get it back. Or sometimes you have a huge amount of text in your Python shell and the viewport is actually not what you need right now. So what you can do is you hit this little up arrow here, and it'll just give you a Python shell, and then you can just work with it. In fact, if you really want to, you can hit this maximize button here, and that'll make everything a Python shell. So now Houdini is just a very expensive, very complicated Python shell. Alright, I'm going to just hit that maximize button again to bring it back, and then pop this down like this. Alright, so I'd like to go over one more feature of the Houdini Python shell before we move on to the second way that we can edit code in Houdini. So I'm going to enter some Python code in here, and if you aren't super familiar with Python, don't worry about it too much because the next video will be a summary of Python, and I'll give you some resources that you can use to learn Python before next week. So if we just type import OS, and then type OS, and then just hit dot, you notice that it brings up this little list here. This list is every single function, variable, class, everything that you could have inside of the module OS. It even has all the magic functions in here, which if you know Python, you know what those are. So this is a really great way to learn any API using Houdini, because if you want to see right away without having to go through the docs, if you want to see right away what's actually contained inside of a module, then you can just use this, and you can immediately see, oh, here's everything that this has access to. This can be great because sometimes when you're reading docs, it's not entirely clear what's actually being inherited by a class, especially if you have things that are really complicated class structures. Houdini will figure all that stuff out for you and dump it into a global list that you can just look at. The second great thing about this is if we go to something like makedir, and then we hit the open parenthesis, you'll notice that the doc string is even displayed. Honestly, this is probably the single best way to learn the Houdini Python API without having someone just sit there and show it to you. Clearly I'm not going to be able to get to everything in the Houdini Python API in this course. So this is a great way to branch off on your own and learn. You can just type module dot and then just go through and say, what does that do? That looks interesting. And then see what the doc string says. Just get rid of that. And then something else to know about that menu is that it actually supports tab completion. And by that I mean if we type os dot, and then we start typing the name of the function that we want, say makedir, you'll notice that there's only one makedir in there. So if I hit tab, Houdini will just complete it for me. I can open parenthesis as normal, type whatever I need to type. Now you'll notice that if you close Houdini and bring it back up again, this Python shell will disappear. And that's really annoying. So the way that you can get around that is by going to the Windows menu again, go to Desktop. You'll notice that it's set to build right now. So what you can do is just say save current desktop. And what this is going to do is it's going to overwrite the build.desk, hit OK, with your current configuration. The second thing we'll look at in this video for editing Python code in Houdini is the Python source editor. For this one, there is not actually a pane type that you can use for that, so it has to be a separate window. But that's okay because you're not going to be using it very often. So if we go up to the Windows, here's this Python source editor. You can just click it, and this is just a module that we can type in. So this is a module that is saved into your HIP file, where you can just type code. So I could type something like print test. And now when I hit apply, notice that it prints out test here. This is because this is an actual module, and we'll go into a bit more about how this works later. But the way that you're intended to set this up is, if I just delete that, you're supposed to create functions in here that you use later. So if I did def blorg, and again, don't worry if you don't understand all the details of this yet. We'll be going over that in the next video. And then if I type print test, hit apply, notice there's no test down here. So the way that you actually use this code is, you'll notice that it says who.session here. That's the way that you remember this. So if we go over to our Python shell and we type who, H-O-U, dot, and then notice that it brings up all of this stuff. And then we start typing session. Then if we hit dot, you'll notice there's blorg there, and that's this that we just created. So I can just add that, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, hit enter, and there's test. So don't worry if you don't understand all of the syntax that we're going over here. We'll go over that in more detail later. The main thing to understand is that you can put code in here, and then you can use it in your Python shell. So one thing I would like to stress is that you should not put code that you're actually wanting to use as part of your setup in this module. And the reason for that is that this code stays with your HIP file. So if you need to copy your nodes over to another HIP file, which happens a lot, or if you need to make a setup or a system of tools out of your network, everything's going to break as soon as somebody uses that in a different hip file. The way that you use the Python source editor is for creating blocks of code that you want to test over and over and over again. And it can be really powerful for that.